Hello, and welcome to this important and timely webinar, Defending Against Cyber Attacks, What Plan Sponsors Need to Know. I'm Rich Jacobs, the Chief Information Security and Privacy Officer here at Mutual of America, and I think it's fair to say that hardly a day goes by when we don't read a headline about another data breach or a cyber attack. And I wish I could say that it's all temporary and that companies are getting so good at cybersecurity that in a year from now, those headlines will all but disappear. But I'm afraid the reality is very different. Cyber attacks and cyber-enabled fraud will continue to be a problem, and all companies, regardless of what they do, how big they are, or where they're located, will need to spend time and resources to protect their operations. I want to make one distinction up front between a cyber attack and cyber-enabled fraud. Cyber attack is an attack against computer systems where hackers look to break into those systems. Cyber-enabled fraud is the use of computer systems to commit a crime, like stealing money. So they're both related, but not exactly the same. So today we'll talk a little about both. Two housekeeping items before we get into the material. First, we'll have a Q&A session at the end of the presentation, and we look forward to your questions. You can submit them online by pressing the orange question mark located at the bottom of your screen. Second, you can download the presentation slides by scanning or clicking the QR code at any time. Just a little background. So prior to joining Mutual of America about 2 years ago, I was a special agent for the FBI for 23 years. And I spent the first half of my FBI career investigating white-collar crime and fraud, and the last 7 years as the head of the cybercrime branch for the FBI's New York office. And I've had the pleasure of working very closely with our guest speaker, Amit Kachhia-Patel, who I'm very proud to say is the current head of that branch and a longtime friend. Amit has a very distinguished background with many years of experience handling both criminal and national security matters, and we're fortunate that he was able to rearrange his busy schedule to be here with us today. And he and I will be working together on this presentation. We'll begin by taking a look at things from the FBI's perspective, including their role in fighting cybercrime and some trends and risks. But we'll also take a look today at what we're seeing here at Mutual of America and how we're handling it. And then we'll conclude with a few tips that you and your employees can use to protect yourselves and avoid becoming victims. And now, to get us started, I'll turn it over to you, Amit. Welcome, and thanks again for joining us today.
Rich, thanks very much for those kind words. I can tell all of you on this call that you are in very good hands. Rich, as my predecessor, had a front row seat to a lot of what I see and have to deal with on a day-to-day basis. So why don't we just start off with what specifically are the FBI's roles and responsibilities when it comes to cybercrime, both when there's an intrusion involved or whether it's a cyber-enabled crime. So at the outset, you should know that the FBI, particularly when it comes to cyber, is not a regulatory agency. So I'm sure many of you are now familiar with, particularly if you're a publicly traded company, the SEC rules around material cyber incidents and disclosure to shareholders. We don't play a role in that other than getting an exemption for national security related intrusions. And so, with that, we don't serve a regulatory function. Our number one goal is to provide relief to a victim. And we'll talk today about the different forms that may take in providing that relief to a victim, whether it's a business email compromise, a ransomware attack, or even a nation state cyber intrusion into a victim. Specifically, our roles and responsibilities, as you see over there, are technical assistance with a view towards investigative leads. So our job at the end of the day is to put bad people in jail. That's a good day for us. In cyber, it takes a little bit of a couple different forms in that a lot of the actors, as we'll talk about, are not here in the United States and thus not accessible to us. And so we really need to build out a threat picture of what these actors look like in terms of their tactics, techniques, capabilities, and really it's that victim engagement that allows us to build out that threat picture. We do have very technical people here in the FBI that can provide incident response, and that's really limited to kind of catastrophic events that involve business continuity as well as kind of national security matters. But we need to have that engagement. We do that in a variety of ways, which we'll talk about, to be able to build out a threat picture regardless of who the actor is. And then this may not be as important for private sector companies, but for the government it is very important, and that is our ability to attribute activity. So just as an example, I was involved with the 2014 destructive malware attack where Sony Pictures had this destructive malware attack leveraged against them by the North Koreans. At the time, it was unclear that it was in fact the North Koreans who were behind this particular attack. Overnight, Sony Pictures network was taken offline. So literally their employees the next day were going out to Best Buy and buying laptops and registering Gmail accounts just to be able to have business continuity. With their engagement with the FBI, we were able to attribute that activity to the North Koreans, and that put our president then at the time, President Barack Obama, in a position to make public statements, as well as some back channel messaging as well, where the North Koreans actually backed off in terms of the harassment that was being conducted against Sony Pictures. So attribution at the end of the day is really important for the FBI, and we can only do that through public-private partnership. And the last piece is we want to have an effect on these bad actors, right? And typically that's through a law enforcement action. But as we'll talk about, if we're able to build out a threat picture, there's unique authorities that we can leverage to take away infrastructure, just as an example, so that these bad actors cannot do that activity that they're doing. So a recent example, Lockbit is a prevalent piece of malware, ransomware that has been leveraged against private industry, particularly against financial sector. We did a takedown of Lockbit just last month where we took away all that infrastructure, as well as things that were out there on the dark web where these actors were able to leverage ransomware against a variety of sectors. So that's what we do at the end of the day. So moving on to things that are affecting you all on a day-to-day basis. This is a little bit of a dated slide, but the FBI runs an outward-facing website that's publicly available called IC3. It's the Internet Crimes Complaint Center. And every year we put out numbers related to what the public as well as private sector entities are reporting to us. So more and more we've been able to get private sector entities to report to us. So it really gives us a pretty good snapshot in terms of what we're seeing trending on a year-to-year, quarterly basis as well. So what you have there are the 2022 numbers. The 2023 numbers were actually just released in the last couple of weeks. And so I've got to actually update this slide. But on a year-over-year basis, we have about 900,000 complaints that come to us either from individuals, third-party counsel usually that are representing a company that's been victimized, or sometimes from the company themselves. They'll report a variety of cybercrime to us. And so 900,000 complaints in 2023 to the tune of $12.5 billion in losses that were reported to us. And I'll break down some of these losses for you. So in 2023, victims lost $652 million to confidence or romance scams. So this is basically, someone who might have been retired, recently divorced, fall prey victim to a romance scam that typically occurs through social media. So $652 million lost through that type of scam. A smaller amount, 2.3 million, were related to grandparent type scams. So this is essentially someone looking to have an emergency scenario involving a family member and is able to convince an older person to wire over or send over $2.3 million. Moving on to crypto investment scams, that was a large portion of the losses, about $4 billion lost to crypto investment scams. So this is where the actors will generate a website related to a particular coin they may have created and then interact with people through WhatsApp, as is just one example, through social media, asking them to invest in this particular coin. They even, once they get that initial investment money, it's a Ponzi scheme where they're actually able to show gains. And if someone wants to get that money back, they're actually able to get that money back, hopefully inducing them to invest even more money in this particular type of scam where they're offering 10% return on the investment, and then overnight that crypto coin disappears. So we've seen $4 billion in losses related to that type of scheme. Another $3 billion in losses related to business email compromise, which we'll talk a little bit more about just here in a minute. But a lot of these now are also being fueled by artificial intelligence. So artificial intelligence allows for two things when it comes to fraud. One is just better use of the English vernacular and English language. So a lot of these actors, a majority of these actors are not here in the United States. I would say more than 90% of these actors, whether they be nation state actors or criminal actors, are actually overseas. And so English is not their first language. If any of you have used or played around with ChatGPT, it allows for an ability to have native language writing abilities at a minimum, right? So spear phishing emails become that much better. The other part of this, which we're seeing more and more of, is voice mimicry. So to the extent that your voice is publicly available, whether that's through YouTube, a pitch deck that your company may have where you may be involved, your CEO, CFO, COO participating in quarterly calls related to shareholders, the actors have an ability to take that voice and now mimic that voice to use in essentially a social engineering scheme. So that's what we're seeing from a threat actor perspective in terms of losses and complaints. Go on to the next slide. All right, here's just a continuation of some of the IC3 data and what we've been seeing. So I mentioned business email compromise. That makes up a little over a quarter of what we see in terms of complaints. So business email compromise, if you're not familiar with it, is essentially a social engineering scheme. And what would happen in the past is actors would target the people within a company that actually move the money. So your finance department, your payables, your billings, those types of departments would be targeted. And it would be a very simple scheme where the threat actor would purport to be a third-party vendor and say that the routing number has changed for particular payments, right? If there are accounts in escrow, et cetera, those will also be targeted. And through that social engineering, the person on the other end, they change the routing number, and now the actor now gets that money wired to them versus where it actually should have gone. Over time, the business email compromise actors have become more sophisticated. So they are now have an ability to do spear phishing. So typically what they're doing is trying to get access to corporate email and build their own intelligence around how money flows within the company. Who are the key people that have essentially the keys to be able to move the money. And then they're able to insert themselves through spoofed emails and purport to be an actual individual within the company that is asking for this money to be moved, right? They're very adept at being able to know, when a particular individual is going to be on vacation and then inserting themselves in. If someone's going to be on travel, inserting themselves in, using Friday, late day to kind of move money. So they've become a lot more adept at when they allow or when they're asking for this money moved, and then really inducing people to believe who they are on the other end. And then, like I said, this is just, increased through the use of AI, both voice mimicry as well as through the spear phishing and that what's available there. What you have on the right-hand side is the top 5 states by number of victims. I would just add that this is a little bit misleading in that, obviously California is number 1 and having reported over 80,000 complaints to the FBI. But if you were to do this on a per capita basis, New York actually jumps to the top. So 3 out of 1,000 New Yorkers actually are targeted and have filed complaints to us through IC3. And then there are also numbers available to the IC3 data in terms of per capita loss, and New York ranks right at the top there in terms of per capita loss as well. So our area here given that it's a financial hub, a lot of money movement, a lot of vibrant sectors here. Not only finance, but construction is big here. Advertising is big here as well, here in the city. So we see a lot of those areas being targeted by the types of schemes that I just mentioned. And so that takes us to, what are we actually seeing from a threat actor perspective? And so this slide here is meant to represent, kind of a ransomware incident, but it's really indicative of the variety of types of incidents that we see. So whether it's a business email compromise, whether it's a ransomware incident, whether it's just a straight up extortion incident, and we can talk a little bit more about what those extortion incidents look like as well. But more and more, we're seeing less malware actually leveraged to get that initial intrusion into a company. So any threat actor, when they're targeting a company or a victim, they need to have some sort of initial access that gives them, access to emails, gives them access to data that they wouldn't have available to them otherwise. And that's sitting behind the actual corporate network. And typically what actors would do is they would use the spear phishing. I'm sure many of you are familiar with spear phishing. I'm sure many of your companies are employing spear phishing training, where a third-party vendor will send out an array of spearfish messages to personnel within the company, and then you get a report back telling you how many people clicked on the link versus didn't click on the link, right? And so the threat actors have become more adept at being able to know that there's more training around this, and so they've been looking for ways to get around this, right? As companies have become more adept, and then threat actors will also look to leverage certain vulnerabilities in software that you use to get that initial access. And so as companies have become more adept at being able to block and tackle these types of ways of getting into a network, what we're seeing more and more of is threat actors leveraging social engineering. So very good social engineering techniques in order to be able to get that initial access. And typically what these social engineering techniques look like are the following. So a threat actor will send out a SMS campaign to personnel within the company. And that SMS campaign usually includes a link to a website that very much looks like the website that you all are accustomed to seeing when you go to log in to your company's resources on the web. So it's asking you for your username and password. It's got the company banner there, and it very much, again, looks like what you're used to seeing. And then obviously companies are now leveraging two-factor so that even if someone were able to get a username and password, they would still have to bypass the two-factor. And so what threat actors have been doing now is they've been following up that SMS campaign with an actual call to employees within the company. And they're looking to target specific employees. So they're looking to target system administrators within the company. So these are the people that maintain your networks. They're looking to target the people that move the money in the company, like we talked about earlier. And they'll purport to be somebody from the IT department and say, it's Mike from the IT department. Did you get my SMS? There's been a problem with your profile. I need you to go ahead and log in, and so that I can address this particular issue with your profile. And Mike from IT is actually a real Mike from IT, because the threat actors have done their homework and know that there is, in fact, this individual that they're purporting to be within the IT department, right? And so in that way, they make it very believable. And then once that individual puts in their username and password into that doppelganger website, the threat actor in real time is taking those username and credentials and now needs that second factor, right? And so in that instance, right, they say, look, I'm from IT. I don't have access to your second factor. You're going to be prompted for your second factor. I need your second factor so that I can address the issue on your account, right? So in real time on the real web page, the threat actor is logging in, now prompting the individual for the second factor, and then in real time logs in under that profile, right? And once they're into the network, it's usually some sort of like smash and grab, where they're going to take whatever data that particular individual may have access to, exfiltrate that data, and then use that for either, throwing a piece of malware down on the network. Typically that might be a ransomware, In extortion cases, literally, you might see 6 months later your company being extorted through that data that was exfiltrated through this social engineering scheme. So more and more, we're seeing social engineering as that initial vector in before the threat actor goes in and does what they do, whether they're a criminal actor or nation state actor. So one of the things that we try to emphasize is, in addition to the Spearfish training, starting to implement a social engineering training program for companies, because by and large, that's how we've seen threat actors get into these networks. So there have been some large incidents, over the last year. If you're familiar with the MGM intrusion that happened a little less than a year ago, where MGM was taken offline, had to resort to paper, that involved the social engineering aspect. We had a third party due diligence / consulting company here that was hosting data related to a lot of the crypto companies that went under, such as FTX. Luna is another one. There was a social engineering campaign leveraged against them, where actors got access to the backend database by social engineering a sysadmin in that instance. So this is more and more a common tactic that you all should be looking out for in order to protect yourself. All right, Rich, I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, thanks. So one of the crimes you just heard Amit talk about were business email compromises. And unfortunately, our clients, all of you, are not immune. We've seen several instances of sponsor-managed email accounts assigned to their employees being compromised. And that resulted in an attacker sending us emails pretending to be the compromised employee. As you can imagine, it's very difficult to catch, because the emails are coming from the sponsor's actual email system. And the attackers spend time reading other emails to and from that employee. And that allows them to create messages that look and sound just like something the real employee would send, and often sending it just at the right time. And when an email compromise like that happens, it doesn't only affect us here at Mutual of America, it affects all other companies that you, the sponsor, and that employee communicate with. So it's very critical that you secure your email systems and educate your employees, just like Amit talked about, on suspicious emails and how to handle them, since that's very often how an email account gets compromised in the first place. When an employee clicks on an infected link in an email or provides information in an email that they shouldn't. Like most companies, we're constantly defending against criminals who attempt to access our computer network. And this comes in the form of malicious emails to our own employees, hoping to get them to click on infected links, or by researching our network from the internet and looking for weaknesses that they can exploit. But because we use a security model known as defense in depth, all these attempts to date, fortunately, have failed. So defense in depth simply means that we use layers of protection, so that if one layer fails, the second or third layer will stop the attack. And I'll talk a little more about our controls in just a little while. In addition to cyber attacks, we also defend against cyber-enabled fraud, which targets participants primarily. For example, we've had situations where criminals obtained a participant's personal information, and that could have possibly come from a compromised email account owned by the participant, or from their social media profile, or even from a prior data breach of another company, and use that information to set up the participant's account online. And that's why it's so important to remind and encourage your employees to set up their accounts with us as soon as they become eligible, so that it's set up with their own unique username, password, and method of authentication. And that'll prevent criminals from fraudulently creating the account using the criminal's own contact information. We also see attempts by criminals to trick the individuals working in our call center by pretending to be a participant. And that's what Amit referred to as social engineering. And it happens at nearly all service-oriented companies. And that's why our call center representatives are trained to authenticate callers before allowing them to make any changes to the account or to complete a transaction. And that includes requiring callers to answer security questions or to read back a one-time passcode sent to a device on file for that participant. There have also been occasions where a criminal obtained the true login ID and password of a participant and then signed into the participant's account and changed information in his or her profile so that future correspondence and even the authentication passcodes would come to the fraudster's email or mobile device instead. Now, a logical question to ask is, well, how could someone get the participant's login information? Well, there's many ways that can happen, but I'll name a few here. One is that a trusted contact, or really someone who was thought to be a trusted contact, like a family member, is given the password by the participant, or they find it written down somewhere in the participant's home. Another way passwords are obtained is from a data breach of another website, like a social media or music services site, where the participant used the same password across multiple sites, including Mutual of America. And a third way is when the participant's device, like a laptop, is compromised and the participant kept his or her password stored in a document on that laptop. And that's why it's important that both sponsors and participants use strong passwords that are hard to guess and to protect those passwords. So we recommend a password that is at least 12 characters in length and one that isn't used across different websites and accounts. And it also isn't shared with someone else, even a relative. I mentioned in my opening remarks that cybercrime doesn't discriminate between large and small companies, between financial companies, and even local pizzerias. Okay, it hits everyone. And that's why you need to be aware of the different types of attackers and what their motivations are. So by way of example, even attackers working for the Chinese government attack small US businesses to gather information. And they use the information they steal and the systems they breach for many purposes. So they're not only interested in what the US government or US military are doing, and you need to be at least aware, right, of the geopolitical risks that could impact US businesses, including your own. Amit, turn it over to you.
Thank you, Rich. So what we recommend is, cyber security is essentially figuring out what your cyber risk is. And that's why we'd like to bring data to the table. And that's why, we make those IC3 numbers publicly available. As Rich mentioned, there are other risk considerations as well when it comes to cybersecurity. That first piece, which he alluded to, is geopolitical risk. So outside of just straight up cyber-enabled fraud for monetization or cyber intrusions for monetization by criminal actors, you could also be the target of a nation-state attack. And that, involves geopolitical risk. So one way to think about it, and I'll use China as an example because a lot of my career actually has been focused on the Chinese cyber threat, is China every 5 years puts out their 5-year plan. And these are industries and sectors that they want to see China being best in class and leapfrog the rest of the world in. So the current Chinese plan, 5-year plan, goes through 2025. And the sectors that they've laid out where they want to be best in class is artificial intelligence, quantum information, semiconductors, next generation military applications, genetics and biotechnology, clinical medicine and health, deep sea, deep space, and polar exploration. So it's a pretty encompassing list. And you might be thinking, well, how does that affect me if I'm a small company? And you'd be surprised at how many companies are involved in, building a lot of this out. So just using next generation military applications as an example, there are, small companies that are making, literally like the ball bearings, right, that go into our nuclear powered subs, just as an example. You might not think of yourself, if you're that company, as being exposed to cybersecurity risk, but you are, because the Chinese want to become best in class in that particular space. Semiconductors is another one. The sanctions that we have levied in the last year and change against the Chinese effectively put their ability to do in-house semiconductors back in 2014, 2015 timeframe. So you can imagine that they're not going to be happy with that, and they're going to be looking to leapfrog themselves in terms of their ability to get access to technology. So they're going to be using cyber in order to be able to get there. So, really take a look at what your geopolitical risk is. And outside of intellectual property, I mentioned the example of the Sony Pictures attack, right? That was another geopolitical risk that unfortunately Sony at the time didn't account for, right? So they put out a movie called The Interview. If any of you have watched it or will watch it after this discussion, it's not a great movie, right? But the North Koreans actually wrote letters to Sony as well as to the UN expressing their dismay with this movie, and that they were not going to sit there and take it lightly if this movie was released. And then, Sony had a destructive malware attack levied against them. Similarly, Sands Casino, their founder and CEO has since passed, but he made some disparaging comments back in, I think I was like the 2016 timeframe, against the Iranian government. The Iranian government proceeded to then conduct a destructive malware attack against Sands Casino. Likewise, we've seen what's happened in the last year, or the last 8 months, unfortunately, related to the Israel-Hamas war. And then shortly after that war, we actually just put out a public advisory on this late during the holidays and early into this year. But we saw the Iranians targeting what's called program logic controllers. These are essentially pieces of hardware that are used to control wastewater treatment plants. They're used in a variety of energy production and, basically for monitoring sensors, that type of thing. But we saw the Iranians targeting a particular programmable logic controller at wastewater plants, looking to make a political statement through hacktivism by targeting these PLCs. So they would, render these, wipe out these PLCs, and then put up a page with a threatening message on those PLCs. So, geopolitical risk, even though you might think that you're not exposed to it, you'd be surprised that just given the geopolitical environment, and we're in a much more kind of anxious geopolitical environment just in general, right? We've got 2 wars going on right now in the world, which is something that, we necessarily haven't had in the last decade. So, think about what your geopolitical risk is, as you map out your cybersecurity risk. The other piece of this is, incorporating your sector risk into it. So this is also from the IC3 data, and this specifically is related to ransomware. So these were the sectors by victim count that were most targeted by ransomware groups. So you can see healthcare and public health are number 1 on there, along with critical manufacturing. So if you're in one of these sectors, you're at a higher risk for being targeted by a piece of ransomware. So, put those two things together, and you can really, kind of figure out where you kind of sit in terms of your risk profile as it relates to cyber, not only nation state, but also criminal as well. Go on to the next slide. Rich, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, so I'll spend a few minutes talking now about some of the controls that we have in place to prevent, detect, and respond to an attack. So what I want all of you to know first and foremost is that your plan information, your participants' personal and financial information, and ensuring that our systems remain available to you when you need them are our primary concerns. And we're going to do everything we can to protect those assets. So among our controls are multi-factor authentication, very basic. When many of you and your participants go to sign on to your accounts, you likely think that having to enter this passcode that comes to your email or mobile phone in addition to your password is a real inconvenience. Okay, but that one item is such a critical part of our frontline defenses that we must have it in place to protect you. Otherwise, passwords alone can and would be easily compromised, and that would allow criminals to access your accounts. So multi-factor authentication makes a huge difference for keeping your account secure. We also require all Mutual of America employees to perform their daily functions from devices that have something called endpoint detection and response software. And that's something we monitor on a 24/7 basis. And that blocks criminal activity and alerts our information security team so they can take early action if they need to. By keeping our employees' devices secure, we prevent intruders from accessing your information. And we protect the confidentiality of our participants by ensuring that their personal information is encrypted when it's not in use. And that means that if a criminal somehow manages to copy that data from our systems without authorization, the information would be unreadable and therefore unusable. Other key controls we use include technology that limits the ability of our employees to send certain participant information, really personal information, outside the company. And I can't stress this one enough. Relying on full social security numbers to manage participant accounts, and I'm speaking directly to all of you sponsors right now, sending files back and forth over the internet with full social security numbers using unencrypted email is dangerous. Very dangerous in today's environment. So I would encourage you to find other ways to manage your plans without having to share full social security numbers and other sensitive personal information on a regular basis with your external business partners and administrators, at least when it doesn't have password protection or encryption. With cybercrime the way it is, and privacy laws in all 50 states as well, that practice will cause problems at some point in the future. So instead, consider using the last 4 digits of the social and maybe a unique employee identifier. I mentioned 24/7 monitoring of our systems already, and we also perform regular vulnerability scans and penetration tests so we can identify weaknesses. We maintain and exercise an incident response plan in case we do have a breach so we can minimize the damage. And we provide security awareness training to our employees and establish the do's and don'ts for using our computer systems within policies. And all employees are required to be familiar with those policies. There are several types of weaknesses, I mentioned pen testing, that we're always looking out for, and you should be looking for them on your network as well. And Amit is going to just walk through a few of those.
All right, thank you, Rich. So we can't talk about best practices unless we talk about, what are the 10 worst practices. And so that's what you see, in this representation over here. So, based on a lot of the victim engagement that we do, along with talking with other federal partners as well, this is actually a pretty good list of what we see are the top 10 misconfigurations that lead to an intruder, being able to get access to a network, and then essentially do what they do. So the first one, and I'll go these one by one. So the first one is default configurations of software and applications, right? So this is where you buy a piece of software and then you just implement the default settings. A very simple example of this is when you get your home router, right? You just plug it in and it works, right? And as long as it works, that's fine. You never think about it again. It's in a closet somewhere, but that particular router comes with a default password. And that particular vendor has probably used that default password or some small subset of default passwords in all the routers that they have sold to folks, right? So if you're a threat actor, one easy way that you could compromise that router is just try the default password, right? So going in and actually configuring that particular piece of software to your particular specific needs, as opposed to just plug and play, that's a common, misconfiguration or bad practice that we see, leading to an actor to access a network. The second one is actually very big as well, and that is improper segmentation of a network. And that is where networks, we refer to this in the industry as being very flat. So that is where a user on the network basically has access to everything, right? There is no segmentation in the network, and they have the same privileges as, say, a system administrator, right? Or they have access to file shares in other departments, just as an example, that they don't necessarily need for their day-to-day work, but that's just the way that the network was configured. So whatever you can do to properly segment your network and make sure that users only have access to the data that they need for their particular job role goes a long way in being able to protect your network. So in the event that you do get compromised, the actor is not able to get access to other parts of the network. Rich, I think, kind of alluded to this a little bit as well, right? So much of cybersecurity today is about behavior. And that is being able to monitor the behavior on your network to look for bad activity, right? And look for illicit activity. So anything you can do to monitor your internal network traffic and outward network traffic, right, will go a long way in being able to proactively identify bad activity on your network. Again, the fourth one is just a reiteration of what I mentioned related to network segmentation. Patch management. And this is, making sure you constantly update your software and your hardware related to patches that are put out for it. So many of you have an iPhone or a Google Android phone, right? You constantly see those updates come out. And that is addressing some sort of vulnerability that was identified on some aspect of that device. So making sure you're very religious about patch management. A lot of what we see is actors getting access to a network where that patch wasn't applied. We talked a lot about email, right? There have been several vulnerabilities related to Microsoft and Outlook in particular over the last couple of years. In fact, Microsoft had an intrusion, I believe it was last year, maybe at some point, or maybe earlier this year, related to actors, nation-state actors compromising their network and getting access to emails, right? And that was related to patch management. We talked about multi-factor authentication. I'll talk a little bit more about that in the SIM swapping example. Access controls, again, similar to what I talked about in item number 2 about network segmentation and admin privileges. Poor credential hygiene. So Rich mentioned strong passwords, right? I can tell you at the government level, the NSA's recommendation is essentially 16 characters. And I think today, quite frankly, the recommendation is 26 characters. That's come out from the NSA. So obviously for the average individual, right, like that's not something where people are going to have 26 character passwords and be able to remember them. The use of password apps, I think someone noted that in the Q&A, we would recommend using them. But again, making sure that you have the proper, username and password around those apps, right? I'm a little bit old school. I still have a book and I write down on paper. And that book only stays with me. It's a small little, 4x4 notebook that I have, and I write down my passwords. Another kind of just quick tip is you can use sentences, and then that will make your passwords easier to remember. But length does matter. And the last one is around unrestricted code execution. So there's more of an emphasis on this, particularly from government coming out and guidelines and frameworks coming out about this. And one of the frameworks that is being pushed, it's called SBOM. And that is essentially a framework that allows you to start thinking about who are your software vendors? Are they employing best practices around the software that they create? A lot of the software created today in the United States is actually created overseas. A lot of it actually, in fact, was created in Ukraine before the onset of the Russia-Ukraine war. Southeast Asia is a big hub for software development. And so you really need to start understanding, do your software vendors, are they using best practices? Like, just as an example, when they create the code, is it done in a sanitized environment? I'm not sure if you all are familiar with SolarWinds. So SolarWinds was a system administrative software, system admin software used by a variety of companies, particularly in the financial sector, that Russian actors were able to compromise because that particular company didn't have the proper controls around when they developed and execute and compiled that code. So the actors were able to inject themselves in the middle, and then anyone who downloaded that software now had a backdoor available to them. So look up SBOM. I'm happy to provide more details related to it, but that'll give you a good framework in terms of how you might start thinking about your vendors and making sure that they have the proper controls around software development. And then real briefly, I'll touch on SIM swapping. So, and I think it goes to the heart of, multi-factor and how to implement multi-factor. So SIM swapping is a technique leveraged by criminal actors where it started a couple of years ago, about 4 years ago, particularly targeting high net worth individuals related to cryptocurrency. And so what the actors would do is they would call up a telco provider, it could be an AT&T, a Verizon, a Sprint, and essentially socially engineer the customer service agent on the other end to port over that particular phone number to a device that they owned. And what was happening was the second factor that people were leveraging, particularly in the crypto space, the second factor was done through SMS text. And so importing that number over, the threat actors were able to initiate a two-factor authentication and then get that second factor through SMS sent to them on a device that they now controlled and owned. So the lesson here is that avoid SMS as a second factor for any of your personal accounts as well as your financial accounts. You can use hard tokens are preferable, right? So if you have an RSA token, as an example, there's other vendors like YubiKey, for example, that will offer you a second factor in the form of a hard token. You can use apps. So Google Authenticator is one app. Microsoft has their own app. There's a variety of apps out there that provide you a software-based token as opposed to SMS text. And so you really should avoid SMS-based text in order to protect yourself against SIM swapping. With that, I'll turn it over to Rich for the next one.
Okay, so I think this is a good point in time to talk about several basic steps that you and your employees can take to protect yourselves from fraud. So first, you should access your accounts periodically to make sure your profile information is up to date and it hasn't been changed without your knowledge. And I can't emphasize this enough. So we see a lot of sponsors and participants who haven't accessed their accounts in years or not at all since they were created. Another best practice that I don't have on the slide here is that you should also make sure you have at least 2 methods set up with us for multi-factor. So an email address and phone are the most common, but you should also consider using Okta Verify, which I'll discuss in just a minute. If for any reason your email is compromised or unavailable, you can still access your account by getting the passcode, let's say via text message on your phone. But if email is the only method set up and it's not available, you won't be able to access your account at all. That's why it's important. Next, protect your email accounts, and that's both personal and business. So much of identity theft and crime, like business email compromises, are the result of weak email account security. And that means don't use weak passwords for your email account. Don't share those passwords. Don't click on links in an email that you can't be sure are safe. And consider using what we call a passphrase instead of a password, which is best described as a sentence rather than a word. Something like, I like to play football, and then you can add a $sign and a 3 at the end. It's long, it has sufficient complexity, so it's harder to guess, and it's easier for you to remember than a password of the same length. Consider using the Okta Verify app for multi-factor. So why is that? As I mentioned, email accounts are easy to compromise. You heard Amit talk about SIM swapping, which means your smartphone calls and texts can also be compromised. So if you receive the passcode via text message and you're the victim of a SIM swap, the criminal is actually getting the passcode instead of you. With Okta Verify, someone would need to have your physical device with the app installed, like your smartphone, to obtain the passcode. So it significantly reduces the likelihood that a criminal can obtain your passcode. Let your employees know that by law, under the Fair Credit Reporting Act, they're entitled to a free copy of their credit report once a year from each of the 3 credit agencies. And by the way, so are all of you. And that means you can obtain 3 of them spread out over the year to see if anyone has taken out credit in your name. Next, don't ignore strange activity on your mobile device, like when you're not receiving calls or texts, or if you receive a message advising that your service was changed when you didn't make any changes. If that happens, reach out to your mobile carrier to see if a SIM swap occurred. Sponsors, protect your computer systems and don't assume that you're too small for a cyber criminal to care about. It simply isn't true. Follow cybersecurity best practices and frameworks like NIST or ISO to improve your security program. And last but definitely not least, if you identify a cyber breach at your company or become aware that any of your participants were the victim of identity theft, please notify us right away so we can take steps to protect that participant's account. And you should also report any cyber-enabled fraud to the website that Amit gave earlier on, ic3.gov. They've got a large database that they use to correlate different complaints, put pieces together, and send it to the appropriate FBI office to investigate. So I think we're getting close to time, and I think this is a good point for us to cover just a couple of questions. All right, let's start with this one. How can we protect ourselves if one of our third-party sites, vendors, consultants that we work with gets compromised? Very good question and a very challenging one. The recommendation is do a lot of the work up front. Okay, when you do your third-party due diligence before you sign the contract, and hopefully you're doing that, you should have certain terms in the contract, such as our data must be encrypted at rest. You must have multi-factor if you want to access our data. And by the way, if you do have a data breach, you need to notify us within 48 hours and provide us with any information that we need. You know, once the attack happens, obviously you have sort of limited options, right? But what you want to do is damage control. And you don't want to get into a debate with the vendor about how long it should be before they tell you and what they're allowed to give you and not to give you. All of those controls and processes need to be contracted at the very beginning. That's the best advice I can give. Obviously, you want to know what this means for your company and your data. What happened to our data when you had that breach? How did you then protect our data from any further intrusion? Is there a clause to get rid of that data once a breach happens? There's a lot of things you can think of, but you need to do the work with a vendor up front. Let's see. Another question. Sorry, Amit, this one is also, I think, for me. But
Yep.
Does Mutual of America comply with the Department of Labor's cybersecurity best practices for ERISA-covered plans? The short answer is yes. So we are bound by a number of regulations, not the least of which is New York State Department of Financial Services regulations. And by and large, the ERISA plans and the best practices are covered almost entirely by the regulation for DFS. So I am very confident in saying that we materially comply with Department of Labor cybersecurity best practices. I think we have, let's see, time for a couple of more. Okay. Let's see. This might be for you, Amit. Threat actor trends. So how many of these are attributed to individual small groups or to the bigger international pig butchering, in quotes, scams that seem to be run more by human trafficking and international organized crime?
Yeah, look, in general, I would say more than 90% of these threat actors, whether they're nation state or criminal actors, are not here in the United States. So business email compromise, majority of those actors, business email compromise along with these romance scams, they're in West Africa. On the ransomware side, predominantly the actors are in Eastern Europe, right? So this is being driven by, local economies. And that is what makes it challenging for us in terms of, stemming this activity, is the fact that the majority of these folks are not here. And it's a very much a entrepreneurial type of model, almost like a venture capitalist model that they've employed, particularly on the criminal side, where they all talk to each other. They know who paid the ransom, who didn't pay the ransom. They know the insurance, the cyber insurance policies better than some of the companies in many instances. And so that's why we say, if you do pay a ransom, just as an example, right, you can likely be re-victimized probably 18 months to 2 years down the line, because they'd all talk to each other. So, that's what we're seeing in terms of like where these threat actors are and how that ecosystem works.
Okay, thanks, Amit. I think we have time for just maybe two quick ones. So another question here for me. So when will MOA implement passkeys? That's almost like someone who knows it's coming asked me that question. So the fact is they are coming soon. I'm not going to put a date out there, but the idea behind a passkey is that, you can go to your computer and sign in to your account, and you can authenticate by going to your Android phone and putting your fingerprint in. So it's cross-device. It would eliminate the need to actually put a password in, because it's authenticated by device. So yes, it's coming. I just don't want to promise you a date, but look for it soon, and we will send out communications when it's time. All right, I think we have one more. So for Amit, if we report a cyber attack to the FBI, will we lose control over our computer systems? And how can we feel confident that our report to you won't end up in the news? That's a good question.
Yeah, thanks for that question. Unfortunately, I didn't include the slide here. One of the slides that we have is, when you call the FBI, there's a SWAT team in gear waiting outside to come in and collect, all the evidence, to include, hard drives and things like that. And that couldn't be further from the truth. As I said at the outset of this discussion, our number one goal is to provide relief to a victim. I had, not this holiday, but the holiday prior, I had a victim call that was a victim of a ransomware attack, had no prior relationship with the FBI, and they gave us details about it. And within 24 hours, we were able to provide them a decryption key. And they were one of the very few lucky victims where we actually had access to a decryption key. So that's what you get when you contact the FBI. The other thing that I failed to mention too is IC3.gov is not just a repository for us to just collect information about cyber threats. Particularly if you have wire transfers that have gone out and you report that through the IC3 portal very early on, that kicks off what we call the financial fraud kill chain, where we actually will work with the banks and look to freeze that money. And then there's a protocol for you to be able to basically claw that money back. So that's another thing that you get, but specifically related to wire fraud when you're using IC3. That last piece is, I'll say, we have got over 120-year history of victim confidentiality. And Rich knows this from his time, working white-collar crime cases as well. We take victim confidentiality very seriously, because one of the things that we do, and the bread and butter of the FBI, is running what we refer to as confidential human sources, right? Because those are situations where life and death is really at play. So we take victim confidentiality very seriously. So you can know that and trust that your name will not be in the news if you interact with the FBI, specifically related to a cyber incident.
Okay, thanks for that, Amit. So we are just about out of time. So I want to let everybody know, first and foremost, this webinar is being recorded and will be available for you to watch on demand after today. So with that, I want to thank you, Amit, again, taking a lot of time out of your busy day to join us. I appreciate that. I'm sure the audience does as well. I also want to thank all of you in the audience for taking time to join us today. I hope you found the conversation useful. Before you leave, we would appreciate if you could take just a couple of minutes to complete a short survey. Thanks, and have a great afternoon.
All right, thanks.